Okay, good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for our discussion tonight on February 17th. We are going to be participating in a two-part class series, and we're joined by Andrea Ingraham, who is an author, political organizer. She is very familiar with California and the history of California, and we're going to actually be discussing Andrea's book, The Lincoln Revolution in California. The title of the discussion is going to be Creating Republican Citizens. And this is absolutely important. At a time of crisis, the survival of our society lies with its citizens. And that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. She's going to go through a little bit of her book and the history around the Lincoln Revolution in California. And particularly, we'll be discussing three contemporaries of Abraham Lincoln that led a successful fight to save California for the Union and how they recruited citizens to join this fight. So join us for tonight's discussion, but also come back for the follow-up discussion that she will be giving on next Saturday. So we're looking forward to this. I'm going to leave the opening there so that we can hear from Andrea. And let me just bring her on here. Okay, you can go right ahead.
Okay. All right. Good evening. So I want to talk tonight about American political culture in the early days of this country, following the revolution especially. Because what you had emerging after the revolution, it even goes back before the revolution, but afterwards it was particularly intense that people took seriously the question of what it is to be a citizen of a republic. Franklin had said at the Constitutional Convention, it's a republic if you can keep it. And people had to really think about what it meant to keep it. And it meant that they had to become more involved, they had to become more informed, they had to become more political and engage not only in electoral campaigns and debating issues of political importance, but also more in-depth being informed, being educated. And so you had things like the expansion of the whole Lyceum movement, where you had these chapters in every town where people would come and study and do scientific experiments. You had an explosion of literary works and literary figures, poets and writers of different sorts. And you had the political campaigns, which also were very intense and which involved a lot of people, and which initiated certain things like stump speeches in small towns across America. You might have seen the picture that was on the invitation of a typical Sunday afternoon during a campaign in the countryside in America, where people are sitting and intensely listening and debating political ideas and ideas in general. So this was unique. This had probably never existed in that way in any form, certainly not in Europe in recent times or any other time that we know of. And it was in that time that Lincoln was born and grew up, and people are somewhat familiar with his history and the struggles he went through to get educated, to learn to read, to borrow books, to study, and so on. And there were others like that. And in fact, some of the people I'm going to talk to tonight were, one of them in particular ended up being a very close, long-time friend of Lincoln's. And others grew up in that time frame and with similar difficult circumstances managed to get educated, get involved in politics, get involved in culture and other things. So I wrote this book about, it's in a way about California and the history of California, but it's really a lesson in how a population can be transformed. And the best can be brought out in people with the right kind of organizing. So it's very much relevant to the kind of situation that we're in today. So with that, I will just start. So the first one The first person I want to talk about in this regard is a man named David Broderick, which I think you have a picture of there, who was a Democrat from New York who went to California in 1849 with his friends who were going out for the gold rush. Broderick had been leader of a political machine in New York City. He was a leader of the Irish immigrants. He was a leader of working class political machine in New York City. And he had actually tried to run for Congress. He had run for Congress, and he was defeated by the Democratic machine because he was not going along with the party line on everything. He was fighting for his own ideas. And he came to California thinking it would be a more open field and he'd have more freedom to organize. Well, he was somewhat in for a surprise when he got to California. But when he got to California, he found himself in the middle of a fight. There was a huge battle going on between Democratic factions. The other faction was led by a man named William McKendry Gwynn, who we also have a picture of, I think, who was actually a representative of the slave power from the South, who went to California to try to establish a Southern control, a Southern Democratic control over the new state. Just so you know, there was a big fight over this every step of the way. That when California, for example, wrote a constitution in 1849, people gathered for a constitutional convention, and the Constitution had a clause outlawing slavery. Well, when this got to Congress, there was a huge freak out. The Southerners were not going to admit another free state because at that time there were 15 slave states and 15 free states. And the only way that the Southerners could maintain any kind of power was to make sure that they were not in the minority. So they were not going to allow California in. And this fight went on for over a year, back and forth in Congress and the Senate, I guess. And the only way it was finally resolved a year later to let California in was with major concessions for the slave states, including like a national fugitive slave law with teeth in it and penalties for people not complying, other things like that. So this is the kind of environment that was going on in the 1850s. This is leading up to the Civil War, where the hostility got more and more intense as the decade went on. And this certainly went on in California. So for most of the decade, Broderick and Gwynn were leading two factions which were constantly at war with each other. Broderick was elected to the state Senate. Gwynn was elected to the US Senate. Broderick was elected to the state Senate, where he was fighting the Southerners there, where they were trying to push through all kinds of bad laws. They tried to push through a Negro Exclusion Act. They had a Cooley bill. They had a tougher fugitive slave law than the national one that they were trying to implement. They had a bill to try to split that proposed to split California in two and create a slave state in the South. So these were all the schemes. Even though California was technically a free state, you had tremendous power of the slave power being implemented and being fought out there. So Broderick was a very courageous guy, and he was fighting these people every step of the way. And he was fighting other fights too. There was at one point a vigilante takeover of San Francisco, where thousands of people were recruited into a vigilante mob to enforce law and order, so-called, and go around executing people that they decided committed crimes. Broderick stood up in a mob of 10,000 people with 50 of his Irish tough guy supporters and stood down the mob and denounced them and asked them if they really wanted to destroy the Constitution. And between his determination and their toughness, they succeeded in stopping them from passing the resolutions they were trying to do at the moment. and this kind of thing. The most courageous side of Broderick came out when he actually was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1857. The first thing he did the first speech he made when he was on the floor of the Senate was to denounce the incumbent Buchanan administration, the Democratic president in Washington. The issue of that day was the Constitution for Kansas, which was a huge fight over whether they were going to have a free constitution or a slave constitution. Now, a pro-slavery constitution had been voted up completely illegally by a group of people, men from Missouri, who came across the border just to vote for this thing. And they voted it up and they sent it to Washington, and the president of the United States tells all the Democrats that they have to support this thing. So Broderick gets up there and says, I'm not going to support this. Just because I'm a member of the Democratic Party, it doesn't mean I'm going to support slavery in Kansas. And people were stunned because here was a young new senator getting up and standing up to the president of the party that he had helped to elect the year before. But he stuck to his guns, and he was really a marked man after that. I mean, there was another point where he was speaking in the Senate where he said, this is funny, that he hoped that future historians would ascribe this attempt of the executive, the president, to force this Constitution on Kansas, on the fading intellect, the petulant passion, and the trembling dotage of an old man on the verge of the grave. You can't help having an image of Biden there and thinking what it would be like if a young Democrat got up and said that about Biden. It's probably too complimentary, because I don't think he had a fading intellect, because he never had one in the first place. But anyway, it would be like that. It would be like a Democrat getting up there and denouncing the Biden administration for the Green New Deal, or for promoting sex change operations for children, and that being the first thing that they said when they got into Congress, into the Senate. Well, this is what it was like, or more so, for Broderick to act like that. And so Broderick, did not back down. There was a huge fight. The state the state county committees in California started to issue proclamations against him, resolutions against him. The state Senate ordered him to follow instructions, because don't forget, in those days, the senators were elected by the state legislatures, and they were basically expected to carry out their wishes. And Broderick refused. He refused all these demands for party loyalty and support of the administration, and the attacks kept escalating. And by 1858, the Democratic Party was splitting into two. There was an anti-Lecompton and a Lecompton, or administration, faction. And the following year, in 1859, they ran two separate slates completely. And at that time, also, you had the Republicans for the first time running a full slate. So this is also just to go to the Republicans for a minute. The Republican Party had started in 1854 or 55, and in California it got started even later. The Republican presidential candidate in 1856 got 18% of the vote, which was much less than they were getting in a lot of the northern states, even by that time. And they were really struggling to get ahead. But there was an outstanding figure that led the way among the Republicans, which was a guy named Edward Dickinson Baker. I think we have a picture of him too. And Baker was a very close friend of Abraham Lincoln's, going back to the 1840s. They were in the legislature together. They were fighting for the Whig presidential candidates together, and they were very closely aligned in their way of thinking and their their outlook. And Baker was already known as from a young age as being a brilliant speaker, a brilliant organizer. He spoke on the Lyceum circuit. He was a favorite to be called out to speak for any public events and a new capitol being inaugurated, anything that needed a speaker. And they did have speakers come out for all of these events. It was commonplace, and people would come and listen to in-depth speeches. But he was known for being able to captivate an audience, to be able to go into a Democratic district and recruit voters to vote for him or to vote for the Republican or the Whig candidate it was at that time. And it was never just with him about getting votes, but always he did that by elevating people to think at a higher level. And he did the same thing, by the way, in court. He was also a lawyer like Lincoln. And he would use these principles in the courtroom to not only defend the Constitution, but to get people to think about the higher principles involved in every one of these cases. And he was not afraid to take on a lot of controversial cases, unpopular cases. So anyway, he came to California in 1852, and he played a critical role in all these respects. In 1858, for instance, in the middle of all this controversy, while Broderick is fighting in the U.S. Senate, meanwhile, Baker gives a speech in San Francisco on the occasion of the establishment of the transatlantic telegraph cable, which was a great technological milestone. It was the first time a telegraph capability existed between the United States and Europe. And I mean, before that, it was weeks getting a message back and forth. It was crazy. So all over the country, they had celebrations for this great event, and people would do things like that. They would celebrate great scientific and technological advances, and it was cause for celebration. And there were always speakers that would go into depth on what was going on. And Baker was the speaker at this event in San Francisco, the main speaker anyway. And in this speech, he details the whole history of electricity and what went on before leading up to the invention of the electric telegraph. And then he pays a tribute to science itself. And at one point he says, "We turn with wonder and delight to behold on every hand the results of scientific method everywhere visible and everywhere increasing. But amid that wonder and delight, we turn to a still greater wonder, the human mind itself." And he goes on and elaborates on that. He directs people to look at the comet that's flying overhead that night, saying that don't forget about God's continuing inventions and direction of the universe. And he ends by saying, I mean, I'm summarizing an hour-long speech, but I'm just trying to give a flavor of the kind of things he was doing. He said, "I've spoken of 300 years past. Can we envision 300 years to come? Can we imagine all the cities and all the people that are going to be living on this shore?" And he refers to the fact that of all the different kinds of people, because California at that point, San Francisco in particular, was like the most cosmopolitan city in the world. There were people from all over the United States, people from all over Europe, people from Asia. This is the first time there was immigration from Asia into the United States. There were people from China, people from India. There were also people from Mexico and South America. And he said, this is a wonderful thing, because this will create a more perfect civilization, a more thorough intellectual development, a firmer faith, a more reverent worship, developing a universal brotherhood of man. And this is how he looked at it, is all the different cultures had something to contribute to adding to the universal brotherhood and the progress of man. And this is the kind of ideas he was trying to impart to people. So anyway, in the meantime, the crisis is still brewing. And the following year, 1859, there were elections in California. And there were 3 complete slates running. There was the Broderick slate, or the anti-Lecompton Democrats. And then there was the administration slate, the people supporting the Buchanan administration. They're also known as the Lecompton Democrats. Well, these were really the Southern Democrats. And then there was a Republican slate. Now, Baker had tried to get the Republicans not to run a slate, to just unify with the Broderick Democrats, because he said, look, we can defeat this administration. We can rally people around the right cause. And anyway, they wouldn't do it. They were sticking to party politics. And ever run into that before? So nonetheless, he continued to fight to bring these forces together. The first event took place in a town called Petaluma. This was the Republican kickoff event. Baker said, I'm a candidate for Congress. He was running for Congress then, expecting to be beaten. He said, but I don't mind, because it gives me a chance to go out and talk to people about the principles of liberty, and to feel that I'm doing something to unite public sentiment against the tyranny in Washington. And he said, in that sense, I'm an anti-Lecompton man, and yet a Republican. And he said, he's trying to bring these people together. He says, I bid in that view Godspeed to all anti-Lecompton men, and say, hurrah for you. You are doing nobly. You have come out from amongst them. You have given up chances for honor, place, and power. You don't mind if they call you half-breeds. Soon you won't mind if they term you blacks. That's what, by the way, the Republicans were routinely branded black Republicans. He said, I know and praise what McKibben and Broderick, our representatives in Congress, have done. I wish them Godspeed, and I really believed if I really believed my running for Congress would be in their way for a moment, I would get out of it before the moment expired. That was his attitude. He wasn't interested in the office. He was interested in saving the country. He goes on about what his idea of the Republican Party is. He says, the history, the poetry, the invention, the literature, the learning of this union is Republican. The books your children read and your grandchildren will read are Republican. The inventions that give beauty to your hearths and brilliancy to your homes are the inventions of Republicans. The stimulus that Republican inventions give to free labor serves you with uncounted blessings. The men who do great deeds and those who record them are alike Republican. And then he has this thing, he says, all the great men of history wrote for freedom. Whoever wrote a poem for slavery? There have been men venal enough to write poetry for monarchs and princes, but no one ever wrote a poem for slavery. So anyway, he goes on like this. He says, at last, when I am dead, when principles shall prevail, these thoughts will remain. They will go forward and conquer. They are gathering now into a stream. They are spreading into a rushing, bolding, and bounding river. They are controlling men's minds. They are maturing lives. They are kindling men's words. They are freeing men's souls. And as surely as the great procession of heaven's host above us moves east in its appointed plan and orbit, so surely shall the proud principles of human right and freedom prevail. And this was cheered. He says, I may not be there to witness that great glory. I may not see the great edifice of the American Republic placed upon so firm and stable a basis that no recreant hand can rise to shake it. Anyway, you get the idea. So he was campaigning around the state. Broderick this is 1859. This was when they had the campaigns for governor and Congress and other state offices in California. And the election was in September. Now, this would intensify as the heat, the heat would intensify as the summer went on. In fact, at the beginning of summer in June, there was a meeting of the convention of the Lecompton Democrats, the Southern Democrats, in which the Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a man named David Terry, issues a scathing attack on Broderick, denouncing him and his faction as miserable wretches and all sorts of things. And when Broderick heard about that, it just happened that one of Terry's friends was there when he read about it in the newspaper. He made a comment like that. I used to think Terry was one of the only honest judges on the bench, but now I take it back. Well, for that statement, when Terry heard that, he issues a challenge to Broderick, not to debate. This was a challenge to a duel, saying, you insulted me, and you either take that back or you better be ready to defend yourself. So Broderick said, I have a campaign to run. I don't have time for this. And they continued campaigning throughout the summer. Broderick waged a very intensive campaign going all over. I mean, you got to realize what it was like to campaign in those days in California. Because the population was in the mining districts, in the hills. And there were no freeways and there were no railroads, and there were boats part of the way some of the time. But most of the time you're on horseback and in carriages, and it's pretty rough travel in those days. But he campaigned all over the populated areas, and Baker did too. Baker I don't think he made as many speeches as Broderick, but Broderick was a senator and he was campaigning to denounce Gwynn, denounce the Southern faction, and to fight for and to defend himself and his actions against the administration, and to clarify why he was willing to attack the administration, which the Democrats had elected. This went on all summer, and the election was the beginning of September, and the Broderick Democrats and the Republicans were both crushed. They had tried. Baker had again tried to unify them, and towards the end of the campaign, there were efforts where some of them dropped out in favor of the other, but it was too late at that point. In any case, the administration people, with the power of the administration behind them, took the election. They won more than both of the others combined, and then right after the election, Terry renews his challenge to Broderick. And the long and the short of it is Broderick was forced into this duel. And guess what? He gets shot and killed. So this was the way that they operated. I mean, the duel was a setup from beginning to end. The issuing the challenge, the having the friend of Terry's there to when Broderick read about it, and then throughout the summer, the newspapers were also stoking this up, saying we're expecting a challenge, we're expecting a challenge, we're expecting this to come to blood, and so it happened. And Baker was the one that gave the eulogy at Broderick's funeral. The funeral was a big deal. It was there were like 35,000 people that showed up for the wake, the funeral, and various parts thereof. People were really shaken up. Baker gave a very powerful speech about how about the fact that this was that he was there. This had all happened because he had stood up for truth, that he had stood up to the power of the administration. And at one point, he quotes Broderick's dying words, which are, "I die because I oppose the extension of slavery and a corrupt administration." And as Baker puts it, his death was a political necessity poorly veiled in the guise of a private quarrel, which is what all of these duels were about. Yes, lessons like Hamilton's or any of these others. It was a way that the Southerners had to get their way. And when they couldn't defeat their enemy by any other means that they knew of. So anyway, after that, Baker had to decide what to do, and he accepted an offer from, or an invitation from some of the old friends of his and Lincoln's from Illinois who had now moved, who were now living in Oregon. And they said, come up here and run for Senate, run for the US Senate. We think you can, if you use your oratorical power and you organize people, we think you can get elected. So that's what Baker did. He moved to Oregon, and he stumped all over the state for 6 months. And long and the short of it is he got elected to the US Senate. They tried to stop him. They had a very strong Southern faction there too that was running the state. There was they had already passed a Negro exclusion bill and all kinds of stuff, and they had considered legalizing slavery there. And the governor was an extreme Southerner named Joe Lane, who actually was a vice presidential candidate with the Southern candidate the next year. And there was the Southerners in the legislature tried to prevent a quorum. Remember, they had the legislature had a vote for the senator. They tried to prevent a quorum so that Baker couldn't get elected. They were found out and brought back. And anyway, he was elected. So that was a big deal. And what Baker did is, on his way to Washington, he stopped off in San Francisco for several weeks. This was in October of 1860. This is right before the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln was running for president. And Lincoln was the Republican candidate. And Baker made a number of critical interventions in those couple of weeks. One was a speech at a theater in San Francisco, which the theater held 4,000 people. 12,000 people showed up. He was greeted as some kind of a conquering hero or something, and it was kind of funny because this was the same people that had voted him down the year before. So he makes this speech in San Francisco, and it was just a real tour de force. It was, I mean, he starts by joking around about Lincoln and so on. He jokes, he says, we're being accused of sectionalism. The Republicans are being accused of sectionalism. We're not sectional. We would be happy to go down south and recruit Republicans. They won't let us. And he says, he goes on along that line. He speaks to all the different factions there, because you had 4 candidates running for president at that point. You had Lincoln, you had Douglas, who was a Democrat, you had Breckinridge, who was the Southern Democrat, and you had a guy named John Bell, who was the Constitutional Party, who was basically remnants of the Whig Party. And so he addresses all of them, saying, look, you Douglas men, Douglas is not going to get elected at this point. Why don't you just go with Lincoln? He says to the Bellmen, look, if you want a Whig, Lincoln is a better Whig than you're ever going to find. Go with Lincoln. And to the Breckinridge men, he says, well, if you really want disunion, then you should go with Breckinridge. And he says, I'm not saying every Breckinridge man is a disunionist, but I am saying every disunionist is a Breckinridge man. Breckinridge was a senator from Kentucky who was the their candidate for president. The Democratic Party also had split nationally by this time, that they nominated 2 completely different Democratic slates in 1860. And but then he goes on from there, and he spends a lot of the time addressing the question of slavery versus freedom directly, and some of these issues that had been forced on people he said, Southern people claim the right to go wherever they choose with their property. I say in reply that the Negro is not property in the general sense. He is property only in a sort of qualified sense. A Negro can be property only in the face of the common law, in the face of humanity, religion, literature, and philosophy. For all these claim that black or white, rich or poor, high or low, a man's a man for all that. And this brought great cheering. People knew the reference to Robert Burns. Anyway, then, he goes on. He says, it's true there were compromises we were forced to accept at the Constitution affecting this question. And we agree to abide by that. We're not going to violate the Constitution. But we deny that the Negro is by common law a slave. He is such a slave only by local law. And we say, catch him where you can, keep him where you can. But when he gets away from your local law, he is free by every instinct of humanity and every principle of the common law. And he goes on along that line. Later on, toward the end, he says, he brings it back. We are a city set on a hill. Our light cannot be hid. The prayers and tears and hopes and sighs of all good men are with us, of us, for us. As for me, I dare not, I will not be false to freedom. Where in my youth my feet were planted, there in my manhood my age shall march. I am not ashamed of freedom. I know her power. I glory in her strength. I rejoice in her majesty. I will walk beneath her banner. I have seen her again and again struck down on 100 fields of battle. I have seen her friends fly from her. I have seen her foes gathering round her. I have seen them bind her to the stake. I have seen them give her ashes to the winds, regathering them that they might scatter them yet more widely. But when they turn to exult, I have seen her again meet them face to face, clad in complete steel and brandishing in her strong right hand a flaming sword, red with insufferable light. And this all gets loud cheering. He says, and I take courage. The genius of America will at last lead her sons to freedom. And then he refers to the previous year when he was forced to make this eulogy for his slaughtered friend Broderick. He said, who fell in your cause and on your behalf. And I said, how long, oh, how long shall the hopes of freedom and her champion be thus crushed? And he says, the tide is turned. I regret my little faith. I renew my hopes. I see better omens. The warrior indeed rests. He knows no waking, nor word, nor wish, nor prayer can call him from his lone abode. But his example lives among us. In San Francisco, I know I speak to hundreds of men tonight, perhaps thousands, who loved him in his life and who will be true to his memory always. In another and higher arena, I shall try to speak of him and for him. And I shall say that the people who loved him so well and among whom his ashes rest are not forgetful of the manner of his life or the method of his death. The reporting of this event in the newspaper the next day was as follows. The scene defies description. The excited multitude were disinclined to leave the place. Long they continued cheering and shouting and singing. Deeper even than this manifestation was the feeling of many who, touched by their hero's words of farewell and the pathos in his voice, wept and even sobbed aloud. When at last the thousands had departed, they went out in a mood quite different from that in which they entered the hall. Then they were expectant. Now they were full of courage and confidence, which spread abroad with the speed of thought. So I generally hate when people read long quotes, but I don't know how to avoid that. Baker did not quit there. He had a few more weeks or another week or two. It was another major event. Maybe there were more, but there was another event he spoke at in Sacramento. This was on November 3rd. This was 3 days before the election of 1860. And I'll have to read you some of the press coverage. I'm not going to read you any of Baker's speech. I don't have the whole speech, and I think I just have a paraphrase, and I think it was pretty similar to the one in San Francisco. But the newspaper coverage of the event is, I think, interesting. It was entitled "The Grand Republican Parade and Mass Meeting in Sacramento." And it starts, "Over the very spots where 5 years ago they feebly, venturingly met together in little dark straggling bands, the impersonation of darkness made visible. In the eyes of their enemies, hooted, jeered, assaulted, and egg bespattered. Last night they marched an army with banners, an army more moving and impressive than Macbeth saw marching from Burnham Woods to Dunsinane, cheering, singing, and exulting. Let us do the Republicans full justice and acknowledge that no such triumphal march has ever been seen in our city, and we doubt if a more imposing political procession has ever been witnessed in the state." And it goes on to describe the procession. "The parade was headed by the marshals and aides, chairman of the Republican County Committee, and other officers of the organization, followed by the Union Brass Band with wide awake escorts and torches. The Sacramento Republican Wide Awake Club, about 60 strong, uniformed in glazed cap and cape, bearing a tiny portrait of Lincoln, saying, 'Our next president,' with banners and transparencies, acted as escort to the barouche containing the orators of the evening. Behind this was drawn by hand and ropes a handsome decorated boat mounted on wheels, and then, in the order in which they are named, the Central Republican Club, about 40 members, Michigan Bar Republican Club, delegation of 14, German Republican Club of Sacramento, delegation of the same number, music, the Mormon Island and the Thomas Republican Club, 22 men, the Big Gulch Club, 40 members, Lincoln Club of Folsom, 50 strong, a car containing young misses representing the states, 7 drays loaded with emblems of commerce, platform wagons drawn by 5 yoke of oxen with a tall genius in a red shirt splitting rails at one end, and workmen engaged in stone cutting at the other." The stone cutter is a reference to Broderick, who was a stone cutter by profession. "A wagon with brooms and broom makers at work, a carpenter shop mounted in another wagon with a workman planing boards, express wagon with load, platform wagon with boiler makers and iron founders at work, a cooper shop on wheels, a daguerreotype establishment, ditto, milk wagons with cans, agricultural carts with produce, a harness making establishment in operation, a cobbler mounted on a wagon making boots, driving the last peg of the democracy." That means the Democratic Party. One transparency represented had a picture of Gwynn throwing himself in front of a rushing train of cars over the Pacific Railroad, crying out, "I've tried all my life to stop the damn thing." By the way, Gwynn was the sponsor of the railroad bill in the Senate, and Broderick accused him of sabotaging his own bill by making it impossible to get it passed. I can tell you more about that later. Anyway, you get the idea. This is the way people had a good time. This is the way they campaigned. This is the way they organized. And 3 days later, Lincoln was elected president, and California and Oregon both went for Lincoln, albeit by small pluralities. Lincoln won about 32% in the 4-way race. But in 1856, the Republican had gotten about 18%. And California, they were up against a very strong Southern machine, backed and promoted by the administration in Washington. So I think I will actually just stop there. There's more I could say if there's not questions or discussion, but I think you get the idea that of what American politics is really supposed to be all about, what really works, that people really do respond to powerful ideas, that the best can be brought out in people, that people do have a better side than they usually put on, that even Republicans can do great things sometimes, which you might wonder about if you've seen how some of the Republican Party members you might have met have acted lately. And that they can be told that this is what their real heritage is. And so that is, why don't I just stop there for now? I think I've talked too fast, but see if there's any questions, and if not, I could say a few other things. And that's a copy of my book, by the way, called The Lincoln Revolution in California. And it's most of what I said tonight is in the book, and there's a lot more details that obviously I couldn't get to tonight.